I've expressed before concern, for example, about some of our critical national infrastructure. Companies like UKPN, which is involved in the electricity distribution in the south of England and in London, being owned by a Chinese billionaire that has links to the Chinese regime. Well, believe it or not, we're lucky enough here in the UK to have a really significant semiconductor manufacturing plant in South Wales, which is called Newport Wafer Fab, which has been there for many, many years. And recently, well, last year in fact, there was a takeover agreed by a Dutch company that turns out to be a subsidiary of a Chinese company with very close links to the Chinese communist regime. Now, in my view, and we're seeing it, there is a shortage of semiconductor chips, and essentially it is strategically important. But luckily, the government does have the ability, under the National Security and Investment Act, in order to determine whether or not to allow takeovers that may not be in our national interest. And the Business Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, has called this in. So a year later, this is still under review. And I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by Malcolm Penn, who is a founder and chief executive of Future Horizons and was also a former director of this semiconductor company, Newport Wafer Fab. Malcolm, a very warm welcome. Thanks for coming to the studio to share your thoughts on this really important issue. And callers, viewers, listeners, if you've got any questions for Malcolm about this particular transaction, or indeed about other items that might be in our strategic national interest, defence industries, things, selling them to potentially non-friendly actors, non-friendly states, then give us a call, 0344 499 1000, and Malcolm will try and help answer with his thoughts, because he's been there at the sharp end. Just tell us a little bit about this company and why you think this British semiconductor manufacturing company is actually of such significant importance that the Business Secretary should refuse to allow the Chinese to buy it.
Okay, thanks, Richard. I think it's important for several factors. It is the biggest mass-producing factory in the UK, so it has a scale advantage, which is important in semiconductors because scale helps you reduce costs and enables you to be competitive. But also, we've seen with the shortages how crucial semiconductors are to every aspect of our lives. I mean, without semiconductors, you can't work or play or do anything these days, and nobody knows about them because they're hidden. It's only because of the shortage that people even understand that semiconductors exist. So they're fundamental to so many other industries that depend upon them, which we are familiar with. And so the products that they make in this factory and in other factories will end up in all sorts of different variety of products. Now, they're not as sexy as some of the products that go into our smartphones that are made by a company called TSMC, which gets all of the headlines because they really are working at the advanced stages in terms of how many components can I put into this thing here. But these are the brawn which makes things happen.
And this is really important because the company that Malcolm has just mentioned, TMMC, is the Taiwan semiconductor chip manufacturing company, which is the biggest in the world, isn't it? By some margin. Based in Taiwan, has also got factories in China. And this then comes back to China's interest in Taiwan, because if they were to essentially invade Taiwan, which is a genuine concern at the moment, they would get control of the world's biggest semiconductor chip manufacturer, and then you can see the importance. What we don't want is that essentially China controls almost all of the production of semiconductor chips. Do you agree with that analysis?
That certainly is the kind of the doomsday scenario associated with that. And it's a very realistic one. We need to be aware of that. And I think certainly certain aspects of the governments around the world are aware of that, particularly the secret services and organizations like that. But I think, the fact remains is we know China has a national policy of wanting to be not only self-sufficient in semiconductors, and they are the biggest user of semiconductors in the world today. So if they were self-sufficient, that would give them a huge market share potential. But if they controlled the whole aspects of the food chain, then you would find yourself suddenly they could control supply to other parts of the world. And Apple, for example, which gets all of its chips of any consequence made in TSMC, If TSMC was suddenly stopped from supplying Apple, Apple would die overnight. It wouldn't be able to ship anything.
And this is the thing, isn't it? If you're over dependent on something, particularly if it's coming from overseas, something that is of really strategic importance, then you're vulnerable. And that's fine when the sun shines, but on a rainy day, it may not look so clever.
That's very true. And unfortunately, we always tend to look at things through our rose-coloured glasses and believe that the sunshines will always be here.
And on the specific company, Newport Wafer Fab, I mean, some have said, well, it's not that big, it's not new tech, it's old tech. Why are you worried?
Yeah, because the parts they make are fairly simple parts in terms of how many transistors do you have in their individual parts. The transistors are the basic switches which we use to make these devices. So, like I say, TSMC could put billions of transistors on a circuit. They put maybe a dozen or so, maybe less. But the fact remains is that just because that they were invented 50, 60 years ago doesn't mean to say they're old hat, because you're constantly improving them, you're constantly implying new manufacturing techniques, you're constantly cost reducing, improving. And so they're using very modern techniques as well as kind of basic techniques, because the parts they make aren't very, they're not technically complex in terms of their device complexity, but they're complex in terms of how you make them. And it's that manufacturing know-how which is just as strategically important as the number of transistors they produce.
That's fascinating. That manufacturing know-how and the fact that it's here in the UK, and if a subsidiary of a Chinese company, I mean, I guess there's concerns that ultimately they could close it down, they could take the tech and the manufacturing back to China, and that again would be foolish beyond words, would it?
It would be yes, it would be. And I think that there's not only that, there were three aspects to Newport's business. They had their main power semiconductor business, which the Chinese need, because Wingtech, the parent owner of Nexperia, which is 100% owned by them, the chairman of Wingtech is the CEO of Nexperia. So you can't even say there's a loose connection there. I mean, the guy that owns Wingtech runs the company. Yeah. So the connection there is very, very tight indeed. So that was the mainstream business, but they had two other aspects of that. They had what was called a photonics business, which a company called Rockley Semiconductors was leading the world in terms of new devices which will go in a generation or so's new smartwatches. There was a compound semiconductor business, which is the next generation of semiconductor technology, and Newport Wafer Fab was the heart of that UK cluster, which was driving that whole infrastructure when the UK has a declared policy to be a leading edge of this new technology, and suddenly the very heart of it is put under Chinese ownership.
Malcolm, stay with us. We're going to take a quick break. This is absolutely, I think it's really important. This is the heart of being global Britain, looking to the future, being self-reliant, independent on critical things, and growing great technology here in the UK. If you've got a call for Malcolm, then give us a ring, 0344 499 1000, about either this company or the bigger picture about allowing sales of strategically important companies to overseas businesses, overseas groups. We're talking with Malcolm Penn, a former director of Newport Wafer Fab, a strategically important, in my view, semiconductor company that is being sold to the Chinese. Now, Malcolm, we've actually had one question here which has come in on Twitter about the company and how successful it was being. I mean, was it doing very well, or was it struggling a bit?
It was expanding very fast, and like a lot of companies, when they expand fast, it was going into some cash flow difficulties. But that was very well understood in the beginning. And Nexperia, which was a customer of Newport Wafer Fab, part of the arrangement was they would help overcome that cash flow problem, which was well understood, written into the business plan, simply to cope with the expansion, because you put the investment in one day and it's a year before you actually get the revenue from that.
And essentially, this wasn't exactly a friendly takeover, was it?
Far from it. The whole board was against it, apart from the two board members from Nexperia.
Yeah, so this is, really significant. And if this was happening in America, right? I mean, would the Americans allow a Chinese company to buy this sort of business?
Absolutely not. I mean, in fact, we believe that several senators have actually come out in public and said this should not go ahead. This deal should not go ahead. It should be reversed.
And so the business secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, well, he's still there at the moment, he's got the ability actually to stop this transaction. Have you made representations? Are you urging him to stop it?
I've made representations as an independent analyst, which is my day job, if you wish. Yeah. I've written to BSI and written to them and responded to their questionnaire. I also wrote a letter in response to certain other developments, encouraging why I think it should still go ahead. And we've also written what next kind of scenario for them, given them various scenarios of how it could be transferred.
Well, give us a call or send us a message if you think this transaction should be stopped. And on the line, we have from Oxfordshire, Peter is on the line with a question. Good morning to you, Peter. Thanks for calling in. So have you got a question for Malcolm or myself?
Mainly, it's a point. I don't think it's just the Chinese we should worry about. I mean, my point is that the Americans have been allowed to buy the British high-tech armaments industry and tech, and it's just, the Conservatives just allowed Kwasi Kwarteng, and it's been going on years. So I think England is being hollowed out, not just, but it's not just Chinese we should worry about, it's America.
It's a great question, and I've talked before about concerns about selling some of our defence business. Malcolm, what's your thoughts on that? Allowing strategically important defence businesses being sold even to Americans, which in theory is a friendly nation, but nevertheless.
Yeah, well, friends you can fall out of love with as well, So, I mean, I think I agree with the caller. I think it's very dangerous that we've allowed a lot of our industries to be sold into foreign hands, and yeah, it's a mistake. I mean, but I think the UK has not really had an industrial policy for a long time, so we don't really know. We're very strong on research. We're very strong on supporting university ideas and incubators, but we never take it beyond that first pillar into the third pillar of turning that into a world-class industry, which is crazy because we used to be so good. When you think back in the terms of Brunel and big industrialists like that, I mean, with the steam engine, I mean, we ruled the world. And now we've got all these industries and we're just simply giving up.
Peter, do you agree with that?
Yeah, my point, exactly, yeah.
Absolutely. We also just had a message in here, which I'll read out. Peter, you might have a view, and then we'll ask Malcolm as well. This tweet has come from a text, actually, there's no name. It says, looks like we're about to... OneWeb is about to be sold to the French company Telestat. OneWeb is, and therefore would be controlled by the French. It's a really significant new growth satellite business. We should be keeping this company away from others, throwing our space tech into the French and EU. Where is Kwasi as the message? Peter, what do you think about that? Are you familiar with that story of this satellite business that the government invested under Boris Johnson hundreds of millions of pounds into, and all of a sudden, a couple of years later, it's being sold again?
Well, I think it's just symptomatic of what the British government do. I mean, we had those, was it Harrier jets? We reconditioned them all and then sold them to America. I think your guess there is spot on about taking things forward with industry, which is I think they did well with industry and the universities, that link up, MIT, whatever it is. But we should have more follow through. And like you say, we used to rule the world with engineering.
Thank you, Peter. What are your thoughts on that one, Malcolm?
I agree. I mean, I don't know why. I mean, I don't believe that government should be the driver at this, because it has to come from industry itself. Industry wants to be globally successful. And we had a very successful semiconductor company in Cambridge called ARM, which, you could argue was a little rinky-dink sort of microprocessor company doing something in a little tiny town of Cambridge. Not that it's that tiny, but they turned that into a world-class product. And it was world-beating, and it's in every smartphone, it's in loads of other appliances there. So it can be done with the right leadership, and they had the right leadership, and they had the determination to do it. So I think what's lacking a little bit is the UK leadership telling government what they should be doing, rather than the government's telling them what to do.
We had a message here, and this is actually quite relevant in relation to steel. We also rescue industries like the banks and railways, but then sell them off again.
Yeah.
To private companies. It seems very short term. Peter, hopefully if you're still on the line, I've also got a view that we shouldn't, for example, have sold British steel to, again, guess who? The Chinese firm Jingye, that also makes steel, and therefore, over time, could run down. Again, another strategically important industry.
Yeah, I'm just a bit thinking about the Chinese, whether we're making them too much of a threat. I do take the point that they're buying up the same as America, but are we saying, oh, Chinese are too bad, you know?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, Rishi Sunak recently, this week, he described the Chinese communist regime as the greatest threat to our economic prosperity and national security. So he's not messing around. I mean, you've had George Osborne and David Cameron; they went the opposite way.
Rishi Sunak, he's been dealing lots with the Chinese, hasn't he? So it's a bit of a two-tongued character, isn't it? You know, saying one thing and doing something else.
You're so right. I think the point is that, and it's a great question, and you can sort of understand saying, look, if you trade with people that, you know, hopefully that will lead to benefits. And, you know, I'm a great advocate of free trade, but it's got to be under, you know, sort of a proper fair system, the international rules-based order. But what you mustn't do is make yourself overly dependent, because, of course, we've tragically seen that with gas and many of the EU countries being over-dependent on Russia for gas. And if they turn the taps off, then it's disaster. Yeah. Malcolm, what's your thoughts on that and the steel industry as well?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the caller. We can't just put the Chinese into the bad basket. You have to look at all of these potential takeovers, because if you lose control of your industry, then you lose control ultimately of your economy. And then it's driven by other factors in there. And you have no control over that. So we should be a more thriving, industrialized nation than we are. And there was this great movement to it being a financially driven economy. Well, that's okay, but don't lose sight of industry. Industry drives the world. It's that really fundamentally drives the economy.
I think that's right. We've got a message here saying the problem with this country, we don't support our engineers and scientists, and therefore they're forced abroad for funding. And I guess you've seen that.
We do, and the other thing is, I think a lot of new startups see that selling their company to a third party is the easy option to getting rich. So rather than taking the long haul and developing a company and employing people and making things, they're looking to be bought out. And I think that's tragic, because we should have much more of an entrepreneurial drive to want to be the next number one.
Peter, if you're still there, are you still on the line, Peter? Are you concerned that this city is too short-termist in just wanting to earn fees by selling businesses to the highest bidder just like that?
Well, that's exactly what's going on, isn't it? They've only got, I don't know, the same as the Conservatives. It's like a 5-year plan, isn't it, instead of, like you say, long-term. And I think the other thing is that I think in the schools and universities and in the press, we've got to have belief in ourselves. Britain is the greatest nation on the earth, and why are we running the country down all the time?
You're so right, Peter. Thank you so much. That was Peter from Oxfordshire. He's concerned about the country being run down. We should think longer term. And we've got a message here on Twitter from Peter Parker. We need more Malcolm Pens. We need to know what the Chinese are up to. We've only to look at the Russian energy supplies to understand what putting all your eggs in someone else's basket means. It's that issue about dependency, isn't it?
It is indeed, and that's the big worry about TSMC, because the whole world...
This is the Taiwanese
company.
Which is the biggest.
If they were even stopped by the Chinese for whatever reason, however they did it, whether it was an invasion or an acquisition or what, the world would come to an end, because I can't think of a single product of any consequence that does not have a chip inside it made by TSMC.
I mean,
it's that serious.
It's that. It doesn't get more stark than that, does it?
No.
But the Americans know that.
Yes.
And yet, in a sense, they've also allowed this dependency to happen.
Correct, because they were driven, as our caller said, by the short-termism. It was cheaper to outsource, it was better for the bottom line, and that's why this whole CHIPS Act thing in America is a bit of a red herring, because at the end of the day, it wasn't the chip company. The chip companies did it, not because they couldn't do it, because they wanted to do it. And the CHIPS Act won't reverse that feeling of the board, their investors, Wall Street, wants them still to outsource.
Malcolm, thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. That's Malcolm Penn, the founder and CEO of Future Horizons, a former director of the semiconductor chip business that I believe should not be sold.